Welcome. We are live on Gordon Food Services, YouTube, and Facebook pages. Welcome, everyone. I'm Mandy Tavonen. I lead RelishWorks Gordon Food Service Innovation Hub. And we are sponsored today by backofhouse.io, which is the place where restaurant operators can explore, try, and buy restaurant tech solutions by providing peer reviews of restaurant solutions, a sense of community, among other restaurant operators, and the latest restaurant news. You know, our industry has been significantly impacted by this pandemic. We've been open and closed and open and closed. And there's been a new announcement of a new PPP package and stimulus package. And we wanted to bring together a group of people who could help us talk about that, but also other things we could be thinking about to get us through these winter months. You know, there's a light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine news, but still we are a couple months left in the winter months, and really looking forward to kind of getting to that light at the end of the tunnel. So we're joined today with a great panel who can help us navigate this. So first is Tom Sullivan. He is the VP of Small Business Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You'll see his bio in the chat feature, but he, you know, at the end of the day, Tom knows everything there is to know about the PPP program. Also, we have Bo Davis, who is the co-founder and CEO of Margin Edge, which is a restaurant management solution that kind of automates those tedious tasks. But he's also the founder of Wasabi, which is a sushi restaurant, conveyor belt sushi restaurant, operating in DC and Boston. So he has a lot of good tips and tricks. And we have Chris Aronis, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at Numerated. And really, Numerated makes it easier for loan application and loan forgiveness applications. It makes it easier to apply and for both the application and the loan forgiveness. So, you know, we really want to talk about these PPP loans first, and recognizing that the loan applications are almost open. Tom, let's start with you. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's different between this stimulus package and this PPP program in particular and the previous one?
So first, I'll turn my microphone on. You know, what would the day be like now if you hadn't forgotten to turn on your microphone? Crazy times that we're living in. I'll start, first of all, by thanking you, Mandy, for allowing me to be on the platform and to help get valuable information out to small businesses. I work for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We represent 3 million businesses, the majority of which are small. And so getting the word out is really one of the biggest challenges. And so thank you for allowing for me to be here. In answer to your question about, well, what's different? Well, I think the biggest difference now and looking back to March, that in March when the CARES Act was first passed and PPP started to become a household word, we thought it would be 3 months. We thought we needed a financial bridge for 3 months, and now we are 9-10 months later, realize that that's just not the case. And so, luckily, several months of advocacy efforts, joined with between 1,600 and 2,000 local, state, and regional chambers of Congress, were able to convince Congress that Main Street needed help. And so on December 27th, they enacted the Economic Aid Act, which created a new round of PPP. Now, that's good news. Unfortunately, it took way too long. It took a lot longer than it should have, because that first round of PPP ended in August. But here we are, and there is help that is available for small businesses. Several community financial institutions that lend to disadvantaged communities have had PPP loans available since this Monday. They were the first loans available. And the reason why these lenders in disadvantaged areas of the country were first is that Congress told them, basically learn from the lessons that we learned back in April and May, is that many of these disadvantaged communities just didn't have the resources to come up to speed in April, May, June, July to actually get loans out. So there are a ton of small businesses, minority-owned businesses in particular, who never even really had access to a first round of PPPs. So SBA, in opening up this program to the lenders in those communities first, is following Congress's direction to target in resources where the need is the greatest. So that is different. It's targeted rather than just pushing capital out onto Main Street the way that it was done in April, May, and June. Second thing that is very important, a difference this time around, is that the PPP loan initiative is available for certain nonprofits, like, for instance, local chambers of commerce. For whatever reason, they were shut out of the first round, which is, I still don't understand that, but they are now able to get a PPP loan. I think a different
lobbying.
Yeah, well, yeah. So Bo was chuckling that was lobbying. Well, shoot, to have 2,000 local chambers of Congress telling Congress that these, basically the economic emergency room for many local communities and businesses to actually be able to survive when golf outings and in-person fundraisers just aren't going to be bringing in money these days because you can't hold them. So we were very pleased that that's a change, that those local chambers are able to access PPPs because they were suffering. Another is that there is a second round of PPP. That is the realization that a 3-month bridge 10 months later ain't going to cut it. And so Congress said that if you have more than 25% revenue loss, you are able to access a second PPP. And that is, there's a limit to that. It's a 2 million cap on that second round PP, but that's a difference. And third, really one of the biggest lobbying successes that happened in this new round is that Congress finally figured out, in order to make this program successful, it's got to be simplified. And so they took out a whole bunch of tax consequences where IRS wanted to come in and take kind of capital that had been raised in PPP forgiveness and basically tax small businesses on it. And Congress said, well, that's ridiculous. You can't free up capital of a small business and then have IRS come in and say, okay, well, we're going to grab it all back. Finally, Congress got that message, and they made the forgiveness component of PPP tax-free. So those are three distinct differences that I think have improved the program and give us some positive outlook in small businesses being able to bridge past the pandemic.
Are there any differences in how a restaurant operator can use the money? For instance, payroll was always covered, but are things like new ventilation or even food or things like that covered under this new program?
Well, great question. And yes, they have expanded. So what you're getting at really is the forgiveness component. So I'm gonna toss it over to Chris in a second. So the PPP loan itself, you calculate how much you can get by taking the calculation of your average employee salary under 100,000, multiply it by 2.5, that's your amount. Then you fast forward to either 8 or 24 weeks and you're in the forgiveness component. And in order to receive forgiveness of the loan, you have to have spent that loan only at 60% on payroll and 40% on expenses. And they expanded the list of what those expenses are. So it used to be mortgage interest, rent, utilities. Now it is expanded to operating costs, supplier costs that, Bo, perhaps you could get into. Unfortunately, it also covers something that is now the reality in many urban centers and small business neighborhoods around capitals. The violence that unfortunately kind of plagues this country right now has resulted in damage to small businesses. And so Congress said that if your small business has been damaged in civil unrest and it's not covered by insurance, you can use PPP proceeds to pay for it. And then last, but certainly not least, the obvious expansion on expenses is the affordability and the pay for personal protective equipment. It's beyond me why that wasn't thought of before, but thankfully Congress added to the list of expenses personal protective equipment. And so I know that in some instances that can be very costly. I know Bo is certainly a restaurant expert. He can get into some particulars of what those expenses are. The ability for Congress to realize what really goes on in a small business right now when they're trying to reopen or hopefully reopen, it's encouraging to know that a lot of those expenses can be forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that 60% delta is important too. When the program initially opened, 75% of proceeds had to be used for payroll, right. And it was reduced to 60%. But particularly if you think about restaurants, if you're in an urban setting, you're in a state capital, 25% of your PPP money is not going to cover your non-payroll operating expenses. There's just no way, which is a large reason why it shifted down to 60%. I think one of the other solid things about the new stimulus package, and Tom, keep me honest, I believe for restaurants, and I'll nerd out for a minute, what we call NAICS code 72, the industry code, has gone to 3.5x payroll instead of 2.5.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes, very, very good catch, obviously, for this audience in particular.
Yeah.
So for that second draw, you calculate it by 3.5. Good catch. And, Bo, I'm curious from your standpoint, because one of the things that they talked about supplier costs, and some of the restaurants I've worked with have told me like that up to reopen, to actually contract with the supplier to say, okay, we're going to start reopening, start delivering those weekly shipments. That's a huge cost. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Sure. And I think one thing that restaurant owners and a lot of small businesses with inventory recognized that maybe Congress didn't is that when our businesses were shut down in March, we owed a lot of money, right? We all run on terms. So we had Gordon Foods and our fish supplier and other suppliers that we owed in our case, and just out of a couple restaurants, something like $200,000 in just regular payables. And so as those payables were due, right, the whole supply chain is backed up and needs that. And so for us, the PPP money was certainly about payroll, but it was also about making sure we could make our suppliers whole so that when we went to reopen, we had payment terms again and we could get those supplies. And so, yes, I was very, very glad to see that in this new round of PPP, that 40%, 60% split is certainly much easier to work with. And the 3.5 versus 2.5 is a 30% bump in capital. So if you got $100,000 before in PPP, you should qualify for 130 based on the criteria you mentioned, Tom.
Yeah, there is that cap. I mean, just to be clear, because I think one of the benefits of this webinar is to set expectations from many of your stakeholders. There is a $2 million cap on that second round PPP.
So the interesting thing with restaurants is they generally are separate legal entities.
Oh, okay.
I would say in our 1,600 restaurants we work with, none of them are going to have a $2 million cap on the PPP because that means your payroll is in the tens of millions annually. So I think this round is very much geared for the small business and for restaurants in particular. And I was really happy to see how it turned out for sure.
Yeah, I think the other good thing about the new version of the package is in the prior version, max employee count was 500. Mm-hmm. They brought it down to 300 to really drive focus in the small business. So you're a franchisee, you're still eligible, but it's bringing that total employee count per location down to 300. which I think, again, further focuses on the smaller end of the spectrum for businesses.
Yeah, and I was going to ask specifically about that. I think that was some of the kind of blowback from the last one, is just seeing some of these big restaurant groups get it. But I did read that there's a specialized set of funding set aside for restaurants with 10 or fewer employees. Is that true? And I guess if that is true, how does someone suggest within their application that this is in fact the set of money that they're applying for? Or how does that get kind of sorted out on the back end?
So, if we're going to go down the nerdy ends of this again, and I can't help it, I'm the tech guy, I guess. The application itself, 2483, for those of you playing at home, is a fairly lightweight application, find different rolled up calculations for payroll and other expenses. Technology like ours streamlines that process, because as simple as this is, I mean, oftentimes people have not applied for credit before, or have not applied for credit at a bank. Also brings in another challenge. I don't think it's any secret, and Tom Bowe and I were talking about this when we were preparing for this session. Restaurants have not always been the favorite target audience for credit for banks because they represent risk. Hospitality in general, restaurants specifically. So what invariably ends up happening is restaurateurs have fewer banking relationships than other business types. For PPP lenders, most lenders really focused in on their existing client base to get PPP loans out to preserve those relationships and potentially grow them and protect their communities, right? Most of our all of our clients are regional and community banks and credit unions. They're not the mega banks. So they were really focused in that area, and they weren't taking on a lot of new customers. The process of vetting a new customer, all the know your customer stuff. If you ever open a business bank account and you come in with your shoebox of documents and they ask for a DNA sample, and it's a whole long process, it's challenging and it can be daunting. Now try to do it when there's a scramble for money. So banks just weren't doing that. The good thing is this time around, many more of the institutions that we're working with are open to taking on new customers. But first stop should always be, if you've got an existing bank relationship, go there first. That is going to be your best chance. You're a known quantity of the institution. They're going to preserve your business. Leverage that relationship. If you don't have that banking relationship, take this as an opportunity to build one, because going forward, you're going to need it. And so banks see this as an opportunity, some institutions, to acquire new customers. Restaurants should look at this as an opportunity to acquire new banking relationships. That's a two-way street.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. What are the other, outside of the PPP loan program, Chris, what are some of the other kind of lending options that restaurant operators might have access to?
Sure. I mean, I think there's probably two lines of answer there. One is other types of loan products that are suitable, and there's other types of lenders that might be suitable in the event that you don't have a banking relationship. One of the interesting things that we've seen emerge recently is non-bank finance companies, we call non-bank FIs, getting what's called delegated authority from the SBA to offer PPP loans. To offer SBA loan products, you have to have certain certifications with the SBA, preferred lender status. I won't get too deep into that unless anyone's looking for an afternoon nap. But for non-bank FIs that service your industry, so we have a couple of lenders that we're working with who are leasing companies to restaurants. They lease equipment. Obviously, the flow-through effect of the downturn in restaurant business is leasing companies who lease to restaurants are also turning down. So we've seen many of them go and get delegated authority so they can offer PPP loans to their customers. So if you find that you're not having luck with your bank or other institutions, looking to some of those leasing companies or other kind of capital providers or credit providers may be another avenue to pursue. Right now, for most institutions, from a credit perspective in the small business sector, particularly with hospitality, it's all PPP all day. That said, there are other SBA lending products. 7A Express is one product that's been out there for some time that focuses on smaller businesses. The reason this whole SBA program is attractive to institutions is because the government is backing the loan. So if the borrower defaults, there is a guarantee on that loan. For most traditional SBA loans, that can be anywhere from 50 to 90%, depending on the loan type and credit size. For PPP, it's 100%. And so there's never been a better time to engage with a bank loan because the risk is lower for them now. And so that represents opportunity. And so I think it should really be a focus area for restaurants who are looking for credit right now.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth mentioning that and Tom, you probably know more about this, but the SBA has also been given additional funds in this stimulus act to help with new loans for new units, right? Expansion, not just PPP.
Yes, and I actually would love to just jump in on something that usually has folks just kind of glaze over. It's a tax credit. So I know, here we go. So it's called the Employee Retention Tax Credit. And before everyone just kind of logs off their computer, hold on. This is cash that otherwise would go to employee withholding. This is not a tax credit that come February or March, you start getting documents together to give your accountant. No, this is cash on the table now. And for those businesses that have experienced revenue loss compared to 2020 compared to 2019, you're talking about amounts up to $14,000 per employee for 2 quarters. Now, we're not going to answer a bunch of tax questions right here, believe me. But when you look at census data that shows 6% of small businesses have ever even heard of employee retention tax credit, compared to 96% of small businesses are familiar with what the PPP loan initiative is, you can see there's a lot of opportunity for small businesses to actually take advantage of something that hardly anybody knows about. So please talk with your tax preparer, or if you use a payroll provider, talk with your payroll provider and say, hey, some guy with a fancy vest on a webinar told me that I should be asking you about the employee retention tax credit, because if you don't, you're leaving money on the table.
Yeah, I think an interesting point here, Tom, is in the original CARES Act, you had to choose PPP or ERTC. And we actually worked with a bunch of our clients and looked at the comparison. And the tax credit was meaningful, but not quite as much as the PPP. But they actually retroactively changed this. So you can actually go back and claim the tax credit from last year. And they've set it up for 2021. So there's, as you mentioned, a meaningful amount of money on the table for restaurants. And again, yeah, talk to your accountant and banker or your payroll provider, but it is a lot of money.
If we just get to like the heart of it, you know, last time restaurants some of them may have had a bad experience. We did hear about that. If we just talk about that, like how can we encourage people to see this as a really great opportunity for them to get them through these winter months until we get to the other side of this? I mean, what would you say to those people who say, I'm not going to do it again? I had a bad experience before.
Yeah, maybe I can start that, and Tom, Bo, you can pile on. The first go round was frustrating for a lot of small business owners. One, it was kind of a foot race for the initial round of financing. Two, you had the I don't have a banking relationship issue, which still exists to some degree. And three, it was a brand new product. I mean, this loan product got spun up in a matter of weeks. Yeah, it was based on some things that existed, but we were all kind of learning as we went. This time around, the government has gone through great pains to make this process simpler for the borrower. Still complicated, there's still calculations. They've actually made it a little more difficult for the lender, but we're helping them with that. I'd say give it another go. I think if you've gone through the first draw and you've learned some things along the way, you've learned what's forgivable, what's not. You've learned which buckets you can pay out of using the PPP money. Other things that we've seen a lot of our institutions recommend to their customers. If you're taking a PPP loan, open a separate account and pay all your payments out of that account with the PPP money, so it's easier to account for forgiveness. Forgiveness, $150,000 this time around, and retroactively to round. No docs. Banks just have to validate that the application is complete, and forgiveness goes. So converting to a grant is a lot simpler this time around. The forgiveness application, the first one that we all saw, made all of our eyes cross. It was supposed to be simple. It was really challenging. I think some folks got tripped up there. So there's been a lot of effort put forth to streamline that process. I also think the lenders just have more experience with it now. They know what they're dealing with. They know how to work with customers. I mean, look, the first time around, the documents that you had to supply to validate payroll and expenses and all of these other things, sophisticated businesses would give you an extract from the payroll provider. Others would give you a spreadsheet. Other people gave you an iPhone picture of a napkin. You saw a little bit of everything. This time around, I think everybody's got a little bit more experience, or a little more savvy. I also think the lenders are taking more time to walk the borrower through because they have more experience with the process. So I'd say give it another go. I think it'll be different for you this time around.
Yeah. Okay. And so just to like kind of recap something I know we've already touched on, but in order to have the loan convert into a grant, so that's like generally that's forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we mean when we say forgiveness. The loan is converting to a grant. Mm-hmm. And in order for that to happen, 60% of the loan has to go to payroll. Am I capturing that? Yeah. And 40% goes to the approved expenses. And those things, that group of 40% has expanded dramatically from previous. So did I recap that?
Yes, although there's one part of this that I think is best answered by the question that a ton of small businesses ask, like, what's this 8 weeks or 24 weeks? Like, is this some type of like, is this like Wheel of Fortune? Like you spin and you, no. So the reason it's 8 weeks or 24 weeks is because at that time that the borrower chooses, it could be at week 11, it could be at week 20, but that's the time where they have spent the appropriate percentages. But really, even more importantly, they have brought back the employee count to where they applied at the front end, because you need to bring back your employee count to where you applied in order to get full forgiveness. Mm-hmm. Now, from a set expectations perspective, I think there's something important to keep in mind. And this got a little bit at what was so frustrating in the first round, is that people's expectations were all over the place because it was a brand new program, as Chris had pointed out. Keep in mind that there are a lot of businesses that going forward won't have as many employees. Right. And if that's the case, then there is a deduction done by a calculation. Chris can probably figure that out better than I can. You still then get that amount that is not forgiven as a 1% 5-year loan. That's not a bad deal. Now, obviously, it's not as good as getting the whole thing forgiven, but it is something that from an expectations perspective makes a little bit more sense on why you would choose the 8 week and why you choose a longer time period, and what types of calculations go into getting that forgiveness, which is, I think, probably a good segue, Chris, into a little bit more of a dive down of what those forgiveness applications look like.
Sure. Maybe just to step back on another quick piece, because I think you keyed in on something, Tom, that confused a lot of people the first time around. But I saw one of the questions come in, like, what if we spend more than 60% or less than 60% on payroll? What happens then? The whole thing doesn't become unforgivable. Right. And there were a lot of businesses that thought, if I go outside of those percentages, I can have any of this forgiven. Not the case. Just the portion that was spent outside of the percentages, we call it a forgiveness gap, is what remains. So to Tom's point, you end up with a 5-year note at 1%. I don't know anywhere you can access capital at that rate right now. I think that's pretty good.
And no prepaid penalty, right? So if you decide when you find out what your forgiveness number is, you want to just pay the rest back, there's literally no downside. You did some paperwork, you got some money, some of it was forgiven.
Yep. On the forgiveness piece, to get back to the propeller heady stuff for a minute, 3483 is the borrower form. There were several versions of it, the 3483, the 3483S, the EZ. It started to sound like tax forms. And the information required back was basically validation and verification of how you spent the money. So showing employee counts, showing payroll, showing any of the non-payroll expenses that you expended the money on. You pass that back to your lender. They review, submit that to the SBA for determination on how much, whether fully or not fully, your loan is forgiven. That form was tough the first time around. Part of the new package required the SBA to simplify the forgiveness process within 10 days of passage of the bill. And so we've seen those new forms. They are dramatically lightened. And the documentation requirements for borrowers, again, for loans under $150,000, have gone to nearly zero. So it's a greatly simplified process, which I think is much, much better. And frankly, even on the loan application side for loans under $150,000, the documentation requirements for the borrower have gone way down too. So I think the goal here is to simplify this process. There's a lot of people that think just froze. They got into the application process. There were a lot of questions they didn't understand because, I mean, it was not necessarily written for human consumption. And ultimately, they didn't proceed with the loan, or they didn't get the application right. And after back and forth with their lender, they got frustrated. A lot of that has been cleaned up this time around. And so I think the other nice bit is if you have an existing PPP loan that hasn't been forgiven yet, and you haven't applied, all of the new legislation that simplifies that process goes retroactively to apply to your first round loan, your first draw loan. So you don't have to go through this crazy process. You can take advantage of the new lighter weight, simpler process.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about outside of the PPP loan, there are other things restaurant, operators could be doing as let's talk first about reduced costs during the winter. I think there's kind of two things we could be doing, thinking about growth and thinking about reducing costs. And let's start with reduced costs. Are there anything, Bo, that you're thinking about or you're seeing happening that where restaurants are spending their energy in that way?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I would start by saying, I think it's important to recognize just how difficult the situation has been for restaurants, right? The top line sales drop has just been staggering. And I know as operators, everybody on this call knows this. And I own a couple of restaurants myself. And, the drop took one restaurant out permanently, and one of them will survive, but it hasn't been easy. And so, the stimulus money is super helpful, and absolutely people are thrilled, everyone I talk to, about having a second round of it. But at the end of the day, we still have to operate the business and keep it afloat. So there's, working in Margin Edge, we talk to a lot of restaurants. We work with 1,600 that we help manage the back office and costs, as you mentioned, Mandy. And so we're seeing, I think, three things that I would mention that are sort of standard trends. One is simplifying menus. And, when things are going great, we always want to make the menus a little bit more sophisticated, a little better, and constantly add more. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 months is really a drawback from that and trying to simplify the menus. And I think that customers are more forgiving now, right, than they might have been pre-COVID. And I think we can take advantage of that, not in a negative way, but in just helping ourselves to make things easier. The second thing, and I promise I'm not saying this because it's sponsored by Gordon Foods, but what we actually are seeing is a consolidation of purchasing from vendors. So on average, our restaurants are buying from 20% less vendors. So they're consolidating where they're purchasing. And I think that's being driven largely by cash flow issues, right? Trying to maximize your payment terms by consolidating your purchases from one place. It's driven by our skeleton staffs and just having to try to order as efficiently as possible. And of course, trimming the menu helps us trim the number of vendors we have to buy from. The last thing I would say is just overall cost management, right? Margin Edge has had 60% growth in our clients in the last 6 months. And the reason I say that is I've been excited to see that a lot of restaurants are using this time period to actually improve their systems to get ready for when things do come back. I think, there's one thing about just trying to sort of limit the damage in the short run. And there's another to recognize that this will get better and trying to make things more efficient. So, yeah, I mean, on the revenue side, I'll just touch on that also real quick.
Yeah.
Raising prices, again, guests are more forgiving than I think they might have been pre-COVID, and they're eating out less. And so if each burger costs a little bit more, I think we can get away with that. And restaurateurs don't like raising prices because we're always afraid that will scare our guests away. But at the end of the day, right now, I think it does work. And the other thing that I think is particularly innovative that I've really enjoyed seeing is, a lot of us have read about ghost kitchens and big companies coming in and building these facilities that will allow delivery services without having a front door, right?
Yeah.
Restaurants, a lot of our clients are starting to think about ghost kitchens inside their existing restaurant operations. So if you own, Bob's Steakhouse, right? You can start Bob's Burgers and Fries by just coming up with a logo, coming up with a menu, listing it on DoorDash and Uber Eats and the other delivery services. Use your existing kitchen, use your existing facilities, test out a new brand, drive some additional revenue with no capital cost. And maybe when things get better, you also have another thing you can do and open a new storefront. So for me, that's one of the ways I've seen people leverage the existing capacity in a way that's really exciting.
Bob's Burgers, that's got a certain ring to it.
From a cartoon. I might have ripped from it.
One of my favorites.
I think it's so interesting to see all of the really kind of creative and innovation in restaurant formats that have come up during the pandemic. And I was describing to someone on a call recently that my husband and I had this favorite Italian restaurant that we love to go to. It's just down the street. And we're pretty cautious, but I just go over there. We go out at nightly walk with our daughter, and I get a wine to go in a coffee cup.
Nice.
And because the city of Chicago has opened up these to go, to go alcohol, and I've been so impressed.
It's amazing. I mean, in Virginia, where I live, I mean, there was no way. We are a southern state with strict liquor laws, and our ABC people walk around with sidearms, like they don't play. And to see people allowed to walk into a restaurant and buy cocktails to go is really exciting. And delivery alcohol, it's given us another revenue source that we certainly didn't have before.
We're all living in New Orleans.
Yes, we are. We're all. I mean, so I guess that's just a question to all of you. What things have you experienced at restaurants during this pandemic that were exciting for you or felt kind of new? And wow, I hope this really sticks around.
Having the best job at the chamber, because I get to speak with small business owners every day. It's been amazing to hear the different things. It's certainly consistent with Bo's description of kind of cost cutting. And I think many of us are sick of hearing that term pivoting. I think there's a recurring theme throughout, though, is that old expression of listen to your customers actually has taken on a whole new meaning. I'll never forget the story of a local restaurant who specialized in fresh fruits and vegetables. Like that was their whole thing. And COVID hit. They were allowed to partially open. Their sales went it was horrible. But at one point, a customer came in and talked with the owner and said, "Hey, look, what I really miss are some of the fresh fruits and vegetables. Have you ever thought about selling them?" And the owner thought, no, I hadn't. They now actually have a whole kind of market stand in conjunction with the restaurant, and they're killing it. And they're not competing against themselves where people are all taking all this stuff and going home and cooking, 5-star meals. But it has allowed for them to have a revenue stream based purely on input from customers that actually saw a niche that was a little bit different than how the owner perceived their value to the community.
Yeah, I think that's really, I've seen a few kind of restaurants also add this market or like corner store,
right,
sell, pantry staples and things like that as well. So I really love that.
We had clients that were selling toilet paper and things like that because Gordon Foods had warehouses full of stuff that got caught midstream. And the regular grocery stores were all sold out, right? And so people started selling everything through the store, and it actually worked quite well for a while back in March and April.
Yeah, Chris, have you experienced a new kind of concept or something like that?
A whole bunch. I've got a couple of good friends here in Boston who are restaurateurs, and they really took on the holiday party cause. So actually, kind of distributed party packages. We have one do basically a Zoom sommelier session. So we have a company that we've been working with on the West Coast. And you think like, a sommelier on Zoom, we got, 95 people enumerated. How much fun can that be? 8 quarter bottles arrive beautifully packaged.
Wow.
They walk you through the whole thing. It was one of the coolest events, live or virtual, I've ever done.
Nice.
And some of the restaurateurs have been doing that with kind of packaged, curated food boxes that have been great. Here in Boston, I mean, we're all kind of East Coast, Northeast, like winter's not favorable for outdoor dining. But man, the number of shipping containers that have been dropped around restaurants where they're actually building up walls putting high canopies above them and heating inside. So you're outside, but you're inside and it's sort of warm. And it's been really cool to just see how creative people have gotten through this time.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Well, everybody's had to celebrate milestones and come up with clever ways to do it. So I see that for sure. Before we kind of move over to a couple of outstanding questions from the audience, I did, what, Bo, just what are you seeing people think about as we emerge from COVID? I mean, we do see a light at the end of this tunnel. I think the vaccine has given us a lot of hope. What are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think the combination of the vaccine starting to roll out and the stimulus at the same time really is a shot in the arm that I have heard from a lot of our clients that we work with, a lot of restaurants, and I've heard already people signing leases, believe it or not, in the fall. And if we all take a minute, I know the last 10 years makes it hard to think of, or 10 months makes it hard to think about what February last year was like. But February of last year, if I asked any restaurant owner on this call what their number one concern was, they would have said staffing. It was hard to find good people, and anybody who was trying to grow, their number one problem was real estate. You couldn't find good real estate. So if you take a step back, and I know it's hard, it's my hardest, I've been in it with you. I know it's hard, but if you take a step back and think, okay, the people are going to go back out. There is pent-up demand. I don't know if it's going to be June. I don't know if it's going to be next November. I don't know the date, but it's going to happen. There's now real estate, and there are great people looking for work. And so if you've got the stomach for it, go out, talk to landlords. They're giving deals like you wouldn't believe, right? They want people who are operators, who have experience, who can come in, maybe not pay rent immediately, but start getting ready for when things do turn around. And I think given what we've all been through, we should get a little bit of the upside of this on the other end of it and be prepared to get some wind at our backs after a much needed time.
Yeah, it is sometimes, yes, for sure. It is sometimes hard to kind of see the opportunities within these trying times, but there are opportunities, like you said, if we can stomach taking them. We do have an audience question that I want to answer, which is, people are looking at these next few months thinking, can I really make it? Can I just make it to April? I've heard this again down the street, a place I shop at. The owner just said, if I can just make it to April 1st, if I can just make it to April 1st. And she's wondering, can I make it to April 1st? Should I just close, cut my losses, or can I really do it? And I think a lot of small businesses, small restaurants kind of are in that same, can I really do this? What advice might you give them if they feel like they are on the brink of closing?
I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, I think the PPP will absolutely give enough funding for small businesses for at least a few months. I think the way the calculation is done, it does provide a meaningful input of capital. And the fact that you can now spend 40% of it on other expenses means you can pay rent with it, right? And you can pay some of those baseline bills that you've got to keep the lights on. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but at least from what I'm seeing, the people we're talking to, I think the PPP is the secret to that bridge. And it would have been great if it came earlier, but it's great that it came.
Yeah.
Well, Mandy, one of our top small business leaders in the country, Maxine Turner, who runs Cuisine Unlimited out of Salt Lake City, Utah, she's viewing the PPP as a bridge not to kind of get back necessarily up and running. She's looked at it as paying the salary of folks who haven't had a salary in a long time. It's been horrible, and so I don't want the viewers to think that we're kind of breathing sunshine and roses. There are really tough decisions. Some have already been made. Some are going to be made in the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months. And the PPP is hugely valuable, but I don't think many folks are under the impression that it is the solution to everything, and that all of a sudden, after getting a PPP, they're going to be up and running and an upward trajectory. That's just not the case. And it's very sad that there are going to be more closures, a lot more closures. And prayers go further than anything. But on top of that, the idea that the dynamism within these communities provides some opportunity, whether it's through another or different restaurant venture or something else. There's plenty of optimism there, but PPP isn't going to keep everybody from closing. That's the unfortunate truth.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, to Tom, I think you made the point earlier in the session. I don't know that this is going to be the last funding of PPP. I'm going to guess it's not, if I had to gamble on it.
Right.
And spinning out the back end of this, there are going to be other SBA products, other credit products. The market itself has just changed.
Right.
The market for credit has changed. The market in particular for small businesses seeking credit has changed dramatically. And I don't see that. It's not like one day everybody's vaccinated, everything goes back to normal, we all forget that this all ever happened. It just changed us all. So I think there is, with the incoming administration, I think with, Tom and his team and the U.S. government kind of working on how do we build a long-term recovery and also create more mechanisms for small businesses to access capital. So if we find ourselves in this situation again, hoping that doesn't happen, but there are more avenues and we don't have to scramble to spin something up of this magnitude, because no one could have foreseen this.
Yeah. And so do you think the new administration, this is a question from the audience, do you think the new administration is going to, there will be new additional funding with the new administration?
Mandy, let me jump in front of this, because so first of all, I think what we've learned with the most recent Economic Aid Act is that in order for something to be enacted into law, it's got to start in a bipartisan way. It's got to be negotiated in a bipartisan way, and then it's got to get across the goal line in a bipartisan way. So the legislative package that was first introduced by Speaker Pelosi, the Speaker Pelosi package, didn't go anywhere. The package introduced by Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, didn't go anywhere. It wasn't until a Problem Solvers Caucus, which has an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, came together and said, well, there's kind of pieces we can agree on. Here's an idea. And lo and behold, the Senate actually had another, I think they called it a gang of 8, bipartisan group, actually did the same thing. It started to move and it got across the goal line. So I'm not sure if the question itself is fair, because the new administration represents the top of the ticket for the Democratic Party. And if it's the administration itself alone making a legislative proposal, it may not be enough to get something through a very narrow majority of the House and the Senate into law. We'd much rather see the incoming Biden administration joining with a group of Republicans, coming up together with a package for aid, and then moving that across. And if that happens, we'd be very optimistic of something happen. The question also isn't like, what can the administration not do that will help a recovery coming out? I mean, the idea that in the restaurants, all of a sudden they're going to have to deal with a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour, which is purely a political number. It is not a negotiated economic number that leads to the number 1.5. But that actually just is not a good starting point, because the folks in the restaurant industry who bear the brunt of a $15 minimum wage are the lowest wage earners. Those are the folks who are suffering the most at this point in the pandemic. So there are some things that the administration shouldn't do that would help the restaurant industry coming in. And so it's a mixture of both holding back on some pretty bold ideas that may really do more harm than good, and then proactively working across party lines to come up with a negotiated package if more federal money is needed.
That bipartisan, you are absolutely right, Tom. After all of that fighting about it for the Problem Solvers Caucus and then the Gang of 8 in the Senate, that really was amazing, and it came together nicely after that. And it was a great lesson that the Congress does still work, as frustrated as we all get. When the two parties come together, good things can still happen.
Yeah. Well, so some of the takeaways I have from this are just, one, build a relationship with your banker or a lender if you don't have one. And if you don't have one, where do you start?
All right. We are the institutions we work with are regional and community banks and credit unions.
Okay.
And generally they are community focused, as the name would suggest. Oftentimes they're customers of your establishment. And so building that relationship is really important. They are heavily focused on the markets they service. So I think that's good. If, before PPP, when, banks were very specifically in SBA lending or not, SBA has a resource called Lender Match, where you can go and find SBA lenders in your markets, in your regions. Still a good resource if you don't currently have a banking relationship. So I'd suggest going and checking out Lender Match on the web. But really focus in on your immediate community in the banks and credit unions that surround you.
I had somebody advise me once, Chris, exactly that. They said, go in concentric circles from your restaurant so that the bank will know the restaurant. And I literally, when we opened our first restaurant in Boston, in Natick, in the suburbs, I did that. It took me 3 phone calls, and the third bank was like, yeah, I know your place. And we started talking. They ended up doing an SBA loan, and we've worked together for 10 years.
Well, and Chris, you forgot the most obvious. Join your local chamber.
Oh,
absolutely.
I missed a softball.
Yeah.
Jeez. I do want to, not only do I want to give a plug for a local chamber membership, because you won't see another group that consistently has bankers and lenders as part of the leadership as your local chamber. I also want to give a little bit of a cyber risk caution. Make sure when you look for Lender Match that it is the SBA.gov recommended Lender Match tool. With federal aid and the flow of money comes some bad actors, and just be careful. Please, please, please be careful. If you receive phone calls, you receive random emails, call them back, initiated by your own phone call to an entity to find out who it is. And then look on your URL, make sure it has an HTTPS before the web, the rest of that URL. So you're not giving up valuable information. So please be careful. Please do not respond to incoming emails and incoming phone calls where they're asking for financial or private information, because chances are, if it sounds too good to be true, it is.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so that was one takeaway, relationship with a banker. The second one I took away was a relationship with a tax person. Mm-hmm. Tom, you got into some, and you were saying things that I'm glad I don't know about. So I am, okay, banker, tax person.
Mechanic.
Well, some of the other things, some of the other things you mentioned, simplifying a menu, consolidating vendors and suppliers. And then the other one is just general kind of cost management. I think on the growth side, we talked about some of these new creative concepts that restaurants are pursuing in order to generate new streams of revenue right now. I think things are, we do have, again, we've said this, a light at the end of the tunnel. Getting through these winter months is going to be there. There are, options and solutions out there for restaurants. So I would want to encourage everyone, as Chris said earlier, give it a go. Even if you had a bad experience before, it's a great option. Any other final thoughts from any of the panelists?
No, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who joined on our channels, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Good information. Learned a ton.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.